Salam and peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field called phi, spelled Phi. Phi is the holophase, a cyclic rhythm defined at every point in the universe. Its first derivatives give us three simultaneous echoes: time, which we call omega, spelled Omega, space, which we call k, and motion, which we call v, built from both omega and k. Above them, higher derivatives form a branching tree that, in principle, goes on forever. Every law of nature is a pattern in this tree of derivatives of phi. Today, we zoom into just one branch of that tree. In part 11, we stayed at the very root of the tree and look closely at phi itself, the silent background that can be shifted up or down without changing anything we can observe. We saw that if you add the same constant to phi everywhere, the entire physical world stays the same. That was global shift symmetry. Phi is like a perfectly uniform color, or a motionless string, or a sheet of paper before any ink touches it. What matters for experience is not the absolute level of phi, but how it changes and how it differs from place to place and from moment to moment. Now in part 12 of episode 6, we climb one branch up from the root and place our attention on the first clear beat that phi produces. This beat is omega, the temporal cadence, the way phi turns in time at every point. Our goal in this part is simple to say and deep to feel. We want omega to become, in your body, what the word heartbeat is in your language. Familiar, obvious, and impossible to forget. I want you to imagine something very concrete. Picture the entire universe filled with tiny, invisible clock hands. At every point in space, at every location in your room, inside your body, out between the stars, there is a little arrow spinning around the circle. That arrow is the local value of phi. In the previous part, we said that you could rotate all those arrows together by the same angle and nothing real would change. That was shift symmetry. What matters is not where each arrow points absolutely, but how the arrows move and how they differ from one place to another. Omega is the simplest and most intimate way those arrows move. Omega tells you how fast each little arrow is sweeping around its circle as time passes. It is the local ticking rate of reality. Think of a field of flowers on a windy day. Each flower sways back and forth. If you film the whole field from above and then play the film back in slow motion, you would see that different flowers might sway at slightly different speeds. One patch may flutter quickly, another more lazily. Now imagine you could pause the film at a single moment and draw a tiny clock above each flower, where the position of the hand tells you how far through its swaying cycle that flower currently is. Phi is like the angle of that hand. Omega is how quickly the hand is moving right now. Where the hand spins faster, omega is larger. Where it crawls slowly, omega is smaller. Across the cosmic field, reality is full of these invisible rates of turning. This picture makes omega feel simple, almost childlike. And that is good, because we want even a young listener to be able to feel what it means. But underneath this simple picture sits a precise mathematical idea. In the formal language of calculus, omega is the time derivative of phi. That means you take phi at one moment, you take phi a tiny instant later, you look at the difference, and you divide by the length of that tiny time step. The result is how fast phi is changing per unit time at this location. For an audio listener, you do not need to carry the formula. It is enough to remember this sentence. Omega measures how quickly the phase of reality turns as time flows. Now here is the key philosophical step. In everyday life, we talk about time as if it were an invisible river flowing the same way everywhere. Seconds tick by, minutes accumulate, hours pass. We carry clocks on our wrists and in our phones that pretend to show a single universal pace. In the holophase view, that picture is too simple. There is no single global time flowing in one uniform way. Instead, there is an omega field, a landscape of local ticking rates. Each point in the universe has its own private tempo. Where omega is high, the local phase races forward. Where omega is low, it drifts more slowly. What we call time is the large-scale story that emerges from this whole landscape of local cadences. To feel this, imagine again that immense field of flowers. But now suppose the wind is not uniform. In some regions, the wind gusts strongly, making the flowers sway very quickly. In other regions, it is calm, and the flowers barely rock. If you stand in one patch and count how many back and forth swings you see in 10 seconds, you might say, here the rhythm is fast. If you walk to a calmer region and count again, you say, here the rhythm is slow. Your experience of how quickly things are changing depends on where you stand. Omega is like that. It is the wind that drives the local rhythm of phi. Physicists, without using the word omega, already live in this world of local ticking. In relativity, clocks on a fast-moving spaceship tick more slowly compared to clocks on Earth. Clocks deeper in a gravitational field tick more slowly than clocks high above. Time is not a rigid backdrop. It bends, stretches, and flows at different rates depending on motion and gravity. In holophase language, all of those effects become statements about how the omega field is shaped. Gravity does not simply pull on objects. It reshapes the local cadences of phi. Let us connect this to something very concrete that sits at the heart of how we define time today: atomic clocks. An atomic clock works by counting the oscillations of a very stable atomic process. You can think of an atom as a tiny alarm that rings with a very specific rhythm when you excite it. Every ring corresponds to one full turn of an internal phase. The clock electronics simply count those rings. In the holophase language, that ringing is one way the atom is reading out the local omega. When the atomic clock ticks, it is following the turning of phi in that region. This is where falsifiability enters with real teeth. The holophase framework makes a strong, testable claim. Omega is not just a convenient label for how one particular system oscillates. Omega is the underlying phase cadence that every physical system must respect when it is used as a clock. If the theory is right, then when two very different clocks share the same environment, their ticks are two translations of the same local omega. If very careful experiments ever found that, after you accounted for all known effects, two co-located clocks were drifting in ways that could not be mapped back to a single underlying omega field, that would be a serious blow to the holophase picture. The written scientific papers spell this out in equations. In those papers, phi is a function of space and time. Omega is defined as the partial derivative of phi with respect to time. Dynamical laws are written so that only derivatives of phi, such as omega, matter. If you add a constant shift to phi everywhere, the equations and their predictions do not change. That is shift symmetry in formal dress. This same structure, when translated into the language of clocks and frequencies, leads to precise numerical predictions that can be checked by experiments. The audio series you are listening to is the gentle surface of that deeper technical ocean. Now let us come back from the lab to your inner world, because you are already an expert in omega without knowing its name. Think of a day that felt endless. Perhaps you are sitting in a waiting room, staring at the wall, or stuck in traffic with nothing stimulating to do. The clock on your phone said that only 15 minutes had passed, but inside it felt like an hour. Then, think of a day that vanished in an instant. You were with people you love, or deeply absorbed in your work, and suddenly you looked at the clock and hours had gone by. In one case, time dragged, in the other, it flew. The physical seconds were the same in both cases, but your inner rhythms were not. In the slow day, there were fewer distinct events, fewer changes, fewer internal updates per unit time. In the fast day, there were many. Your subjective sense of time is tied to how many noticeable changes cross your awareness per second. In other words, your nervous system is constantly estimating something like omega, not in a literal quantitative way, but as a felt density of change. Now imagine that instead of one omega field for the whole universe, you have many overlapping layers. There is an omega field for some underlying physical phase. There are omegas for electrical oscillations in your brain, for hormone cycles in your body, for social rhythms in your culture. When all of these line up to create many changes in a short interval, time feels full and fast. When they thin out, time feels empty and slow. Holophase theory does not pretend that this entire rich hierarchy reduces to one number. But it suggests that at the deepest level, all these layers are built on patterns of phase change, and that omega is the most basic name we can give to how fast reality is cycling here. Let us widen the picture to a more playful scene. Imagine standing in a stadium full of people clapping. At first, everyone claps at random. The sound is chaotic. Then a rhythm starts. People begin to align their claps. Slowly, a single beat emerges. Thousands of hands slap in unison. The entire stadium now has a shared tempo. Omega, in this picture, is that shared beat per second. But each person also has their own micro deviations, tiny local shifts in timing. You can zoom in and see that the global rhythm is made of many local omegas interacting. Many systems in nature behave like that stadium. Fireflies flash together, oscillators synchronize, neurons fire in waves, lasers produce coherent light. In each case, individual rhythms lock into a shared cadence. The Holophase picture says, these are places where the underlying phi field has managed to align its local omegas into a coherent pattern. What you see as synchrony is really the phase field singing in tune with itself. Again, this is not just a poetic gloss. In the full equations, synchronization shows up as a constraint relating the phases and their time derivatives in different regions. Different physical systems lock to a common omega because the underlying dynamics make that alignment a stable configuration. That claim can be checked. If the holophase model says that certain patterns of synchrony should or should not occur in a given setup, experiments can look for them. If they are not found, the model must be refined or rejected. Let us now climb one step higher in the temporal tower and peek at what sits above omega. If omega tells you the local ticking rate, alpha tells you how that ticking rate is changing in time. You can think of alpha as the acceleration of the beat. If omega is constant, alpha is zero. The rhythm is steady. If the beat is speeding up or slowing down, alpha is non-zero. Higher up still, you have what is sometimes called jerk, the rate of change of alpha. These higher derivatives give the flow of time its texture. You feel this every time you listen to a song that gradually speeds up, or watch a movie scene that suddenly shifts into slow motion. Your body responds not just to how fast events are happening, but to whether that speed is itself changing. In a roller coaster, the sudden changes in acceleration, the jerks, are what make you gasp, not just the constant speed. In phase language, those jerks are the higher time derivatives of phi. In the master tree, omega is the first branch of the temporal tower growing out of phi. Alpha, jerk, and all the rest are branches above it. As an audio listener, you do not need to memorize their names. It is enough to know that time, in this picture, is not just a single flat speed. It can vary, and that variation can itself have higher order structure, all encoded in successive derivatives of phi. Let us bring in another everyday analogy: watching a film. A film is made of many still frames shown one after another. The frame rate, say 24 frames per second, is a kind of omega. It tells you how many images you see per unit time. If the frame rate is low, motion looks choppy. If it is high, motion looks smooth. If you play the film at half speed, the effective omega is lower. At double speed, omega is higher. Now imagine a very strange film, where the frame rate itself changes during the story. Some scenes are in slow motion, some are normal, some are sped up. The feelings these shifts produce map almost directly to changes in omega and alpha. A gradual ramp up in frame rate feels different from a sudden jump. Once you understand omega as a local frame rate of reality, many familiar experiences become easy to describe. The holophase step is to say, instead of treating these frame rates as arbitrary settings chosen outside the system, we treat them as expressions of the underlying phi dynamics. Omega is not a knob you dial from the outside. It is a field that obeys equations of motion. Those equations tell you how the local ticking rate can and cannot change in response to other parts of the system. Because of that, there are very concrete ways to try to falsify the theory. For example, suppose the holophase equations say that in a particular configuration of matter, motion, and gravitation, the omega field must satisfy a specific relation. Maybe it cannot change faster than a certain amount in a given region, or maybe neighboring points must keep their omegas within a particular ratio. Then you can design an experiment to probe that. In practice, that might mean building an array of ultra-precise clocks, superconducting oscillators, or resonant circuits, and measuring how their frequencies shift relative to each other when you change the environment. If you find patterns of change that violate the constraints implied by a single smooth omega field, that is evidence against the holophase model. If you find patterns that match those constraints, especially in regimes where standard theories had nothing particular to say, that is evidence in its favor. You do not need to follow the technical details to appreciate the spirit. Every symbol in this story must eventually be willing to stand in front of an experiment. Omega is not a mystical vibration hiding beyond reach. It is a proposal about what lies underneath the ticking of the devices we already build. Either that proposal matches reality, or it does not. Before we go further, I want to remind you of the larger structure wrapped around this audio journey, because that structure is part of what keeps the Holophase program honest. What you are hearing now is the story layer, tuned for the ear. Underneath it lives a formal layer, written in mathematics and operational physics. Over the last years, I have written more than 30 scientific papers that build this framework. 4 of these core papers are already printed and archived on Zenodo, an open scientific repository. Anyone can download them, follow the derivations, and check whether the model really does what I am claiming. The point is simple. This is not a private mythology. It is a public, falsifiable proposal about how reality works. Those written papers contain precise twins of the images we are using here. When I talk about phi as a cyclic rhythm, the papers define phi as a phase field that takes values on a circle. When I talk about omega as the local ticking rate, the papers define omega as the time derivative of phi with respect to a chosen time coordinate. When I say that only changes of phi matter, the papers encode that as symmetry under adding the same constant to phi everywhere. Every soft phrase in the audio has a sharp symbol in the formalism. This pairing between story and equation is how we make sure that the language can be translated into predictions. Let me give you a taste of how omega shows up there, translated into simple speech. In many systems, we meet a quantity that counts how quickly patterns repeat. like the pitch of a tone or the color of light. In standard physics, we call that a frequency. In the Holophase formalism, those familiar frequencies are understood as different ways of reading out omega along different patterns of motion. We write equations where phi oscillates in time with a certain omega and in space with a certain k. Then compare the resulting frequencies with what we actually measure. If they match, that is one success. If they do not, the model is wrong in that regime. Omega is therefore not just a poetic word for rhythm. It is a symbol that either lives or dies by comparison with experiments. You might ask, why do we need this new layer when engineers already work perfectly well with frequencies? One answer is unification. Today, atoms, circuits, vibrating strings, and many other systems each come with their own separate formulas. The holophase approach tries to write all of them in one language by tying every frequency back to the same underlying phase field. Another answer is reach. In familiar settings, our existing models work beautifully. But in extreme places, where strong gravity, quantum behavior, complex media, and information flow all meet, it helps to have a single, deeper description. In those regimes, a unified omega field may reveal patterns that a patchwork of separate frequencies would miss. This connects quietly to the tally view of energy that we developed in earlier episodes, without us needing to repeat that story in full here. In the holophase model, energy is not a substance floating around. It is a careful tally of how active the phase field is, of how strongly and how quickly phi is changing. Omega naturally appears inside that tally, because rapid temporal change contributes to the overall busyness of the field. You do not need to think about that accounting now, but it is worth knowing that the same omega which shapes your clocks also enters the deeper bookkeeping of the holophase dynamics. That is one more reason to understand it well. Let us sketch one more style of experiment that could, in principle, help the holophase program if it fails. Imagine building three different clocks: an atomic clock, a superconducting resonator, and a stable mechanical oscillator, all side by side in the same shielded room. In the holophase picture, each device is reading out the same local omega in its own language. If we slowly change some external condition that, according to the equations, nudges the omega field by a tiny amount, all three clocks should show the same fractional change in their ticking rate. If, after removing all known sources of noise, we found that their shifts could not be related to a single shared omega, that would be serious evidence against the model. This is what it means to put falsifiability at the heart of the story. While we wait for such refined tests to mature, omega can already change how you relate to your own experience of time. In the usual picture, you are a small object being carried along by a rigid external timeline. In the holophase picture, you live inside a sea of rhythms. Some you cannot touch, like the rotation of the Earth, but others you can influence, like your breath, your steps, your patterns of attention. When you feel rushed or drained, it is often because your inner omegas and the outer omegas you are trying to follow are badly matched. Seeing this can shift the question from what is wrong with me to which rhythm am I trying to dance to right now, and is it really mine? This does not magically solve life, but it gives you a clearer sense of where your real freedom lies. You cannot negotiate with the number of seconds in an hour, but you can choose how densely you pack those seconds with events. You can notice when your inner ticking is too fast and gently slow it with pauses, breath, and simplicity. You can notice when it is too slow and gently quicken it with movement, novelty, and connection. In doing so, you are not fighting time. You are learning to surf a local omega field. The same concept that appears in equations on Zenodo shows up as the felt art of tuning your own rhythm to the situation you are in. Before we close, I want to invite you into a very simple personal experiment that asks nothing more than your attention. Sometime today, choose a very ordinary action: washing a cup, tying your shoelaces, climbing a flight of stairs. As you do it, quietly notice the rhythm of the action. How often does your hand repeat the same motion? How often do your feet strike the ground? How often does your breath cycle in and out? Do not force anything, just watch. You are listening, in a rough way, to small local omegas expressed through your body. Then, on purpose, change the rhythm. Move more slowly than usual, then more quickly. See how your sense of time and effort shifts with the tempo. You will find that the same objective task can feel long or short, heavy or light, depending on the rhythm you inhabit. That is your direct experience of how time in daily life is braided together with local cadences. Now imagine expanding this awareness outwards. The pulse of traffic in your city has an omega. The rise and fall of conversation in a room has an omega. The daily opening and closing of shops, the routine of work and rest, the turning of day and night, all have characteristic cadences. You live immersed in an ocean of rhythms. The Holophase story simply pushes this intuition to its limit and says, underneath all of these, there is a deeper phase field whose local rate of turn is the fundamental omega. As we step out of part 12, picture once more the master tree in your mind. At the base, phi glows softly, the silent root. One level up, the omega branch shines in a warm color, the first clear beat. Above it, the rest of the temporal tower rises, refinements of how that beat can change. To the side, you see the spatial tower, which we have not yet climbed, starting from K, the weave of space. In the next part, we will move to that branch and study how phi varies from place to place, not just from moment to moment. For now, you can carry a simple sentence with you. Omega is the local pulse of time, the rate at which phi turns here and now. When you look at a clock, when you listen to music, when you feel your own heart and breath, you are touching small, partial reflections of that pulse. In the holophase view, you yourself are a pattern in phi, riding the omega field of the universe. Salam and peace be upon you, and I will meet you in part 13, where we will learn to see the weave of space through the eyes of K, the spatial pattern of the holophase.